It's really good to have you back, Lenora. If I didn't say it before, it really is. We are indeed abundantly blessed in all the musical talent that we find and that we get to share here at Unity of Birmingham. So, this week I'm starting something new. We've been for the past several weeks talking about our core values and kind of taking a deep dive into what we as a church are all about. And the truth is one of the things that Unity has always been about is prosperity. From some of the earliest parts of our Unity history, we have been teaching people that how we meet the world, how our experience comes to us, is really up to us. You know, kind of like the song says, we really are sitting on a gold mine, and it is really up to us. At one point when things were just getting started and they were still kind of making ends meet very slowly, they were worried, some of the employees of Unity, and they went to Myrtle Fillmore, who is one of our co-founders, and said, Mama Myrtle, we really need to pray for some more money. And she looked at him and said, no, we need to pray for more faith, which is a tremendous lesson because it's really about that faith that we have in the universe and our ability to discipline ourselves to continue practicing our faith that allows us to bring abundance in all of its different aspects into our lives, not just money, but the rest of it as well. So what we're going to be doing for the next 4 weeks is diving into this book, The 4 Spiritual Laws of Prosperity by Edwene Gaines. How many of you have seen Edwene here before? Okay, so you know who I'm talking about, right? This is a woman who started with nothing and who has really done some amazing things simply by affirming these simple spiritual principles. And she's going to be here in a couple of weeks. She'll be here on the 28th, not only doing the Sunday service, but also doing a workshop afterwards. If you've never attended one of her workshops, I highly recommend it. And even if you have, it's good stuff, and you'll probably want to go back. But before we do, what I'd like to do is describe what Edwene means when she talks about prosperity. So Edwene's definition of prosperity is a vitally alive physical body to provide a comfortable worldly home for the spiritual beings that we are, relationships that are satisfying, nurturing, honest, and work all of the time, work that we love so much it's not work, it's play, and all the money we can spend. Does that sound like prosperity to you? Now, I would also add to that one more thing from The Keys to the Kingdom, which is by David Owen Ritz, who's another great prosperity teacher. And he talks about prosperity as having 5 components. He uses those exact same 4, he says them a little differently. But those same 4, and then adds to that a spiritual prosperity, having a relationship with God or spirit or whatever you want to call it that feels abundant and full. Now, I think that perhaps Edwene's point is if you actually do the things it says to do in this book, if you follow these 4 spiritual laws, you're going to have that. You're going to have that spiritual connection with the God of your being. It's almost impossible to avoid. It's kind of like going through the 12 steps, those of you who know about recovery. If you go through that process, it's just about impossible not to have some form of a spiritual awakening. If you follow these 4 principles as daily practices in your life, it will be impossible not to have some kind of a good spiritual life. But there is more to prosperity than simply financial abundance. Health, relationships, and being joy-filled, living our purpose are all big parts of that. So some of you are probably wondering, well, what are these 4 spiritual laws? So before I get into the first one, I will just kind of let you know what they all are so you can actually focus on number 1. So the 4 spiritual laws of prosperity are, number 1, you must tithe 10% of all that you receive to the person, place, or institution where you have received your spiritual food. Number 2, you must set clear-cut, tangible goals. Number 3, you must forgive everyone all the time, especially yourself. And number 4, you must seek, discover, and follow your divine purpose. And I can pretty much guarantee if you manage to do all 4 of those things, you will not only be prosperous, but you will, in fact, have a joyful spiritual life because you will be connected to Source in a way that you have not been. So one of the things Edwene likes to say, it's a saying that I think she got from her grandfather, is that if you have to swallow several live frogs, it's best to swallow the biggest one first. Don't know, it's one of those old Texas sayings. I don't know what they do in Texas for parties, but anyway, of those 4 principles, although forgiveness is tough for some of us, probably the biggest frog to swallow is tithing. So we're going to talk about that today. And I may talk about it in ways that you have not heard it talked about before. Now, I know that many of us come from faith traditions where not only was tithing emphasized, but it was almost used like a blunt instrument. Amen? Right? And when I say that word, does it trigger anybody or make anybody just squinch up just a little bit? Right? Yeah, I'm seeing a couple of people nod up and down. Probably a couple of you are like, not going to say anything. Right? So let's break down tithing. You know, what I want to do today is I want to talk about, first, I want to talk about our relationship with money. I want to talk about what tithing actually is, what's the definition of tithing, and I want to talk about how it shows up in our lives. You know, what does it look like to actually be a tither? So the first thing is, let's talk about money, all right? When we say we're tithing, we're actually talking about tithing 10% of all of the income we receive to a place where we are spiritually fed. And that might be a church and it might not be. All right? But for many people, that seems almost impossible, or it seems abusive because they don't understand that the point of tithing is not to keep the church open, it's to keep you open. Right? Many of us have had a very difficult relationship with money. So many of us are taught growing up that money doesn't grow on trees and that there's just not enough for everything that you want. And that we have to work really, really hard and that we probably don't deserve everything that's out there in the whole wide world. We talk about the relationship that we have with money. And it's funny, there's a lot of talk in contemporary society about the 1%, the ultra rich in our society. And then we have the 99%. Well, other than the fact that the 1% have a tremendous amount of money at their disposal, there's, I think, a real reason why we have different attitudes about it. Now, I get privilege, okay? I get that people who were born into that financial elite are going to have opportunities that many of the rest of us do not have. Many of the rest of us may not have had the opportunity to just write a check for tuition to an Ivy League college. Many of us may not have had connections with captains of industry. But one thing that people who grow up in that kind of environment have that many of us do not have but could is a different relationship with money than many of us do. Most of us who grew up, in the lower part of the bell curve financially, grew up being told that there's not enough. We don't get to have what we want. We have to lower our sights that kind of money, just doesn't exist. It doesn't grow on trees, over and over and over. Whereas people who are used to having money and using it like a tool don't develop a fear of money. They're not afraid of it. They understand that it's there to be used, not there to be wished for or afraid of the things that are connected with it, like bills and tuition and all those things that we become afraid of when we grow up in lack consciousness. So abundance consciousness and lack consciousness become a very different way of living our lives. I remember when I was a little boy, this is going to date me now, but usually around the end of summer, we would get a catalog in the mail called the Sears Wish Book. Some of you remember that? Okay, if some of you are too young to know what that is, it was like old school Amazon.com. Because it had everything in it you could possibly want. Okay? And you could look through the pages and find everything from an awning for your backyard to women's undergarments to hardware to toys. And for little boys like me, the things that were really the cool stuff was, what am I going to ask for Christmas, right? That's why they call it the Sears Wish Book. Gee, I wish I could get this for Christmas. Well, my mom, God bless her, she didn't want to disappoint my sister and I, So what she would always do is kind of subtly give us a number to work with, It's kind of like, this is sort of what you can, this is what you can shoot for. Santa can probably manage this, which basically meant, that's what she could talk my dad into spending on Christmas, right? And I know she meant well. She did not want to see us on Christmas morning, open our presents, and have a disappointed look on our face. She didn't want to disappoint us. She didn't want to see us be disappointed. I get that. But what my mom was teaching us is to put limits on our wishes, to put limits on our understanding of what the universe is capable of providing to us. To say, I may be the greatest kid in the world, I may have done everything right all year long, but that's the highest I can hope for. Not, whatever the big thing was that I might have really wanted. I don't get that. I'm not worth that. There's not enough. And year after year after year, I kept getting that message over and over again every time the wish book got delivered. It's hard to grow out of that consciousness. It is hard to grow out of always being told there's not enough. You have to struggle. Some things are just never going to materialize in your lives. And I know when my sister and I both wanted to study theater, right? Both of my parents were absolutely beside themselves. Nothing is ever going to come of that, I think the only reason I was able to is because I got a full ride scholarship in acting, right? Those kind of things don't happen to people like us. That's what we get told. And from that consciousness, we develop our consciousness around what is available to us in the universe. And it is a very different consciousness from people who grow up thinking that money is their friend. Things that require money are not impossible to achieve. We can just go out and make some more if we need it. No big deal. So simply turning our relationship with money around and realizing that we are here to use it. It's not here to control us. When we become the masters of money, when we develop that consciousness that it's all out there. We live in a universe of infinite possibilities, and you never know what can happen next. J.K. Rowling was an unemployed single mom who was writing stuff on notebooks before she finally sold Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone. That was the title over in England, which became Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone, the first of the Harry Potter series, which made her a billionaire before she gave away so much money to other people. And she kind of dropped down into the multimillionaire ranks again. It is possible to create from where we are, no matter who we are, and no matter what we started with. But it has to begin with the way that we think about money and prosperity, okay? So with that in mind, that requirement that we have to change our thinking, let's talk about tithing. First of all, let's talk about what tithing is, all right? In a nutshell, tithing is taking 10% of whatever income you have and giving it to where you are spiritually fed. So, where does this come from? Well, it actually comes from the Bible. It is an old tradition. Most of us will cite a verse in Malachi, and it's actually a promise. And not only is it a promise, it's a challenge from God, and he says, try it. Test me. It says, I'm starting with Malachi chapter 3, verse 10. Bring the whole 10th part to the storage house, so there might be food in my house. Please test me in this, says the Lord of heavenly forces. See whether I do not open all the windows of the heavens for you and empty out a blessing until there is enough. I will threaten the one who wants to devour you so that it doesn't spoil the fruit of your fertile land and so that the vine doesn't abort its fruit in your field, said the Lord of heavenly forces. All the nations will consider you fortunate, for you will be a desirable land, says the Lord of heavenly forces. Try it. Test me. Almost no place else in the Bible does God make a challenge like that. Bring it in, watch what happens. And so many people say, but that doesn't make sense. I don't understand how that works. Well, you can try to figure it out, or you can just try it. But if it helps to have some reasoning behind the why does it work, I'll put it this way. Tithing is essentially our way of saying to the universe, I believe. I believe that there is enough for me. I believe that I am the child of a loving Father, Mother, Spirit, that I am part of this universal flow, and that there is more than enough for me. And I believe this so firmly and steadfastly, I know that I can give a 10th part of whatever comes to me back, and I cannot outgive the universe. But the real what it's doing to us, the real why we do this, is about faith. Charles Fillmore, who is one of Unity's co-founders, says that faith is the perceiving power of the mind linked with the ability to shape substance. Okay? Means that's my ability in mind to see something that nobody else can see is there and bring that into manifestation to make it actually happen here in the material world, whatever that may be. And faith is kind of like a muscle, right? If we don't ever believe, if we don't ever exercise our faith, we're not going to do a very good job of perceiving and shaping substance. All right? What we have to do is to exercise our faith. Now, some people I know have, they've tried tithing. It's like, well, I tithed for a month, nothing happened. How many of you have started a workout program, especially January 1st of some year, maybe January 1st of this year, right? And you lift weights for about a month. And then something happens, you get busy, you quit. Do you stay pumped up? Right? No. Not only do you not gain much, but you probably end up losing everything that you gained because you have to keep working that muscle. And actually, you have to keep adding more resistance as time goes by. It's the same thing with tithing, right? If you're going to try tithing, Edwene suggests do it for 6 months. Do it for 6 months and see what happens. Because that was kind of the challenge that she made to herself. And within 6 months, she'd doubled her income. Within her first year, she'd tripled it. But there's also a piece to this that I want to divorce from magical thinking, all right? And what I mean by that is it's not like waving a magic wand like they do in Harry Potter, and suddenly it's there. If I start tithing, God doesn't owe me something immediately. What it is about is developing that relationship, that trusting, faith-filled relationship with the universe that says, I get it. There is plenty for me. I'm going to give back to where I'm spiritually fed, and I trust that not only my needs will be met, but my heart's most deep-felt desires as well. And it's living in that place of trust over time. It's funny how in good times, many of us think that there's not enough. But sometimes when things get really tough, we will finally give this a try. Edwene talks about this in her book, where she was really struggling to make ends meet as a single mother who had a couple of jobs, was trying to start her own business, and really didn't have 2 pennies to rub together when she began tithing. And tried to wiggle out of it, tried to find an out clause, but there wasn't one. It just said, bring in 1/10 and see if I don't open up the windows. In my own life, I actually began tithing in 2009. And what was going on at the time, I was the associate minister at Christ Church Unity in Orlando. I'd not yet gone to Unity Village and become a Unity minister, but I had been ordained in an irregular fashion. That's a different story for a different day. And I was serving as the associate there. Now, I had not yet gotten all the way to tithing. I was probably at about 6 or 7% of my income. And the tithe, or the offering checks that I wrote every month added up were second only to my house payment, in terms of how much I was giving, but I still wasn't quite tithing. Now, Alice, who has been here before, was our senior minister, and Alice teaches tithing and believes in tithing. And I knew that pretty soon, if I was going to stand up there on that platform next to Alice, I was going to start tithing. At the end of April of that year, I go into my office one day, and Rick, the guy in the cubicle next to me, is packing up his stuff. And I was like, Rick, what are you doing? He's like, I just got fired. I was like, oh man, I'm so sorry. Is there anything I can do? And I hear from over here, the executive vice president, who's not normally in our little cubicle farm, says, Charles, can you come in here and talk with us for a moment? Uh-oh. I probably told this before in a different context, So I go in and I get laid off. Well, the first place I went was my church, because that was the family that I had to go to. But it was at that point, when I had lost the vast majority of my income, that I finally decided desperate times call for desperate measures. And so I started tithing, even though I couldn't pay all my bills, right? I couldn't make my house payment on what I was just making in the National Guard, right? Not even close. So at that point, long story short, I was probably about $300,000 in debt, maybe a little more. I had a toxic property in Florida that I was upside down on, at least $160,000. It was pretty ugly. And I was really almost unemployable because I was going to be deployed the next year, and nobody's going to hire somebody who's going to be going away long term in a very short period of time. So, to cut to the chase, after I began tithing, within 2.5 years, all my debts were paid. I no longer had that toxic property, and I had enough money in the bank to put me through ministerial school. My attitude about tithing is pretty simple. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. So I continue to tithe because it worked for me. Today, when I write my tithe checks, it's one of my favorite things to do all month. I enjoy it, and I have actually upped the amount of my tithes. I forget whether it was our last town hall meeting or the one before that, but I was describing the church's finances, and I asked everybody to step their giving up. So I stepped mine up, and I now tithe, and then I add another %. So I'm giving 11% now, because I wouldn't ask you guys to do something I wouldn't do, right? And it is a joy, because the more I give the universe, the more I receive. I can't explain it. All I know is that it works. And the feeling I get, not only individually, but as the minister of this church, when we became a fully tithing church. There are times, and our board members will tell you, there are some months when, the numbers look pretty scary. It's really nice to know that we are taken care of because we tithe. For me, it's that simple. And it may seem like a little child wishing, but let me tell you something. Last year, we come into December, and we are about $40,000 in the hole. Now, normally in December, we get a pretty good bump because a lot of people give extra at the end of the year. Normally we're about $20,000 income above expenses in December. But had that stayed true to form, we still would have ended up in the hole last year. New Year's Eve, right? I get out of my Jeep over there in the parking lot, and someone approaches me and says, "Would you pray with me? I'm about to write a really big tithe check, and it's a little scary." Right? She was tithing on her inheritance. And here's what's fascinating. Last year, the church made about $319,000. So a tenth of that, which is what we sent out in tithes to various places where we as a church were spiritually fed, was just under $32,000. Guess how much the check she wrote that night was for? Just under $32,000. It paid all of our tithes for the entire year, and we ended up the year in the black. Had no idea that was coming. When we live by principle, it just shows up in ways that you can't predict. I wouldn't have known that. I had no idea. And I also promise you that that wouldn't have happened had we not been demonstrating tithing, both as a church and me as an individual, And had we not been teaching people the power of it? It's amazing how things show up. So when we talk about what is tithing in our lives, a lot of people have questions about tithing. Do I tithe off my net or my gross? Can I give to charity? Is that a tithe? Edwin talks about all of that in this book, and we have several copies in the bookstore in case you're interested in really digging into it. But the bottom line is this: you won't know the power of it unless you just give it a try, right? Now, one thing I will say is where we tithe to where we are spiritually fed. That doesn't mean that 100% of your tithe goes to this church if you receive spiritual food elsewhere. I don't see Chris here today, so I can't ask him if it's okay to talk. But we have a guy here that I know does a lot of yoga, right? He's probably there, several days a week. So if he gets a lot of his spiritual food from that ashram, am I saying that right? Right? Then I would expect a lot of his tithe to go there, maybe some to come here, right? If you are a snowbird kind of person and you live here half of the year and you live someplace else half the year, right? I would expect it to be about halfsy-halfsy. Right? So it's not about us supporting this church. We'll talk about that at the town hall meeting later. Bottom line is if you're in ownership with this church and you're a grown-up, you help pay the bills. That's real simple. But that level of giving and the spiritual practice of tithing are two entirely different animals. We tithe and it becomes advanced spiritual work. It's about changing who we are, not changing the bank balance of the church. Do you get where I'm coming from with that? It's really a practice that changes our way of looking at money so that we can understand that we are the children of a rich parent, just like those 1%ers, right? That there is unlimited abundance available to us when we are willing to open up, to allow those windows of heaven to open up and pour out an overwhelming blessing for us. Please join me in prayer. Sweet Spirit, we give thanks for all of the abundance that is ours, for the health, for the prosperity, for the loving relationships, for our divine purpose, and for our relationship with you, for that deep and passionate knowing that we are loved and we are provided for, no matter what. No matter how things may appear in the moment, we know that we live in the kingdom of heaven. Today we choose that kingdom of heaven, and for its presence we say thank you. So it is.